The northern lights are always in the distance. What I didn't know before I flew in space is that the south magnetic pole is far from the South Pole. On my space flight, I was lucky enough to get assigned to help film this IMAX movie, and I kind of took that on as my own personal project. I filmed the entire movie in my spare time. The director was Tony Myers. Any IMAX space movie that you've seen has been Tony Myers, but working with her was probably the highlight of my NASA career. Before we left Earth, Tony had given me a long scene list. I had 300 shots she wanted, but she was so funny, she'd always say, look, if an alien shows up in the window, just because it's not on the scene list doesn't mean you can't film it. Turn the camera on and start filming. So, and that was a great lesson, not because of the aliens, but because I'm there on scene. If I see something, film it. And a lot of the scenes in the movie were not on the shot list. They were, hey, this is beautiful, and I would just get it. So the story arc was finalized after we got back to Earth. Tony had an idea in her mind. She had given me this, we talked about it, she had given me the shot list, but the reality is the movie was really made in post. You can't just have nature scenes. That's interesting, but that's not what you want. You want a human story. And she was really good at putting that together, but it kind of came together after because like there was a Christmas scene that I shot, there were some crew scenes that we shot, there were things that got filmed that she hadn't been planning on that helped her make her finalize the story arc in post. Probably the shot I'm most proud of was one I got of my crewmate Samantha in the cupola, which is this big observation module, filming Earth, but it's really hard to get exposure of her inside and the Earth outside. With a flash, you can do that. The fill flash does it for you. We didn't have lighting. We had to film it over this one jungle over South America. Like it was a countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, all right, go. And I did this and I did this moving in. So it's not that, it's a quick scene, it's not that great of a scene, but for me, I know how hard it was to get the focus pull and the exposure and everything without anybody helping me, no track, no lights. That was a fun scene to do. So we used a Canon C500 and we had Zeiss lenses. So they were Cineprime, giant $20,000, $50,000 lens. They were great equipment. Most of our scenes were just shot on a bracket. There was a few moving scenes. It's hard to move in space because even though you're floating, your body still has some tremors. So just holding that camera, there's still a little bit of intrinsic motion. And Tony's like, oh, it looks great, but I know the problems you have. The northern lights and the southern lights especially are spectacular. The northern lights are always in the distance. What I didn't know before I flew in space is that the south magnetic pole is far from the South Pole. So our orbit actually went through the southern lights. The northern lights were always in the distance, but the southern lights were right there, and it's this surreal, you're flying through this alien plasma. It's the most surreal experience I've ever had. Filming them is a challenge because you're going so fast. You have to have a prime lens. You have to push ISO, either 6400 or 10,000 minimum. And that lets you shoot about 1/10 of a second on a bracket, and that's pushing it, right? But if you do everything just right, and getting focus is not easy because you can't look through the lens and get your focus. You have to use the monitor and the zoom in preview because in the dark you can't see what you're focusing on. So anyway, there was a lot of technique and art that went into that science, but the images are just spectacular. So our interior lighting was basically ambient, the fluorescent lights. And we had these small little LED bricks. The external lighting was the sun and the moon. And you'd think that's great, but man, the sun is bright, and that creates some real challenges. The moon, on the other hand, if you had a full moon at nighttime, you could make the Earth look like daytime. High ISO, long exposure, and the Earth looks like daytime, except for you see city lights. I've got this great northern light scene of the UK, Scandinavia, Moscow, and you can see the cities, and you can see the city lights, and you can see the northern light. So that moonlight was perfect to get everything and exposure. filming the sun was one of my favorite things. I loved F-22, the starburst, I think just looks really amazing. One of the most challenging things to shoot is the sun through the atmosphere or the moon through the atmosphere, in part because the exposure is so extreme. You're going from dark to really bright in a matter of seconds. And so manual exposure can't keep up with that. Watching sunrise and sunset was my favorite thing, because shooting, you can expose for either the beginning of sunset or the end of sunset or the middle of sunset, but you can't expose for all of them. And you're just going from a really bright exposure to a really dark exposure in a matter of seconds. Before I went into space, I was an amateur photographer, and I feel like after I got back, I was a cinematographer, because I had to think of the ideas and then set all the gear up and then film it and then act in it. You know, I had to hit red button and float to the other side of the camera and be the talent. So I kind of got involved in everything. And one of the things that I learned is sound is critical, and also lighting. One day we were just doing an interview for the news, and I said, let's get some lighting, and my crewmate said, we don't need lighting, lighting doesn't matter. And I was like, lighting matters, man, it's important, you know. So a lot of the art of cinematography was the same in space as it is down here on Earth, but I learned my lessons, I cut my teeth in space, which was an interesting way to do it.